We come to the 50th presentation of this 2014 year of the series Parayana, the way across, the way beyond. Parayana. If you're doing a personal discipline, it's a yoga. If you're doing a very large scalar dynamic, it's a yana, it's a way. A para yoga does no good. It's overkill. But there are very high ways that are parayanas, and we're discussing how, at least on this planet, in this star system, the Parayana has been civilization. The 50 is an ancient time form. It is called a jubilee. And the 50th day, because one computes time on this planet by the day and night, make a full day. You can even divide it 12 hours of the night, 12 hours of the day. When you have in the year the evenness of the 12 hours of the day and night, which is the equinoxes. March 21st to September 21st. And to go with that equilibrium of the equinoxes is a perpendicular. The solstices, the shortest day of the year, which is the longest night, and then the longest day of the year and the shortest night, the winter solstice coming up for us, December 21st, and the summer solstice. So that the annual, the year, divided into quarters, is 4 quarters to actually go with 4 seasons, to give an abstract, hypothetical quality of a quaternary of a complete cycle. Not just a circle, but a cycle. And that cycle fulfills itself when it is complete. So that the completion is the end of the year, which then instantly commences the beginning of the new year, the next year. For us, this is just 12 days before we have a big celebration of Christmas. And actually, it's very close coming up to a celebration related to Christmas called Hanukkah. And Hanukkah will be celebrated next week. Today, being December 13th, is the beginning of the 12 days before Christmas, which is hardly recognized, or even needs to be recognized, usually, whereas the 12 days after Christmas end on, traditionally, January 6th, which is the day of Epiphany. That there is a realization in the new year, the 6th day into the new year, and it is a revelation which then is able to be contemplatively celebrated by the 7th day, the first 7 in the new year, so that the Epiphany of January 6th on January 7th will have its Sabbath, first Sabbath of the new year. In that sense, one begins to recognize that time, as a measurable dynamic in civilization, has a ingrained commemoration of these kinds of time forms that initially were not well expressed or developed, but that in time, in several centuries, as a matter of fact, it was getting used to what was going on, and it took a period of about 2,000 years before there was a poetic, discursive, written language expression of what all of this amounted to in terms of not just a cycle of life on this planet, but in terms of a very much larger scalar of a spiritual vastness that had more dimensions than what the world offers with its 4 dimensions. It is a deep quality that the Jubilee is a celebration of a new beginning. It is the culmination of the 50, but that culmination of the 50 is celebrated in such a way that it is an offering that the dawn of the next time period will be blessed because of our sacrifice. And the ancient high Semitic understanding of it was that the 50th day, the Jubilee, was an offering celebration of the first fruits of a harvest, which then extended to a range, a scalar of 7 foods or drinks, products that kept people sustained in their life. And thus the annual cycle of the year had 7 such jubilees of first fruits, harvest, and sacrifice. So that the 7th sacrificial offering day in the year was the culmination of this Sabbath of appreciation for what is needed for life. And that left, in terms of the experience of days and nights in an annual cycle, a period of about 15 days that needed to be made up. And in that 15, the 14 days, the bulk of it, was a special set aside, not a harvest of this world, but it was a respect for a harvest of another kind, a larger amplitude, a different scalar. And so that 14 days became known and is known in English as a fortnight. And 14 became like 50, like 7, a quality of realization about time and its meaning, its dynamic energy, and its manifestation in space as phenomena, as actions, as the way in which we're gifted with life. And with the recognition of a higher meaning, even than the deep meaning that we can come to understand by living life, by the experience of being able to use language in an oral way of commemoration of what all of this we're doing, what the rituals amount to, what the mythos, the mythic experience of it is in terms of feeling and its expression in tones, in sounds and sights and feeling tones within ourselves. and how it all comes together in symbols into the nexes that are the structure of thought itself. And so the quality within nature of rituals, myths, and symbols makes together a completeness of a 4-phase, 4-season, 4 quaternary qualities of time to give us a sense that there are different measurements which now can be utilized to expand the day, the 24 hours, the 12 days, 12 nights, hours, so that together now we have an index not only of the day, but of the week, of the 12 months of the moon, with a little extra seated in to respect the days of the dark of the moon and the recognition that there is then a day which is extra holy and sacred, and that day would be the 365th day. It's outside of the 7 first fruits jubilees. It's outside of the 14 as that kind of numerical set that this is special, and became in the enlargement not just 14 extra days, but eventually came into a very much larger time scale of human life, of generations, so that 14 generations became an archetypal set, especially in the very earliest North Semitic oral language tradition, which becomes important because the first time that there was a transform of a written language, which began to appear about 4350 BC. By the time of about 2350 BC, it reached a very high civilized quality that you had an author whose name we know, who wrote literature which could still be read and was finally rediscovered and brought back into translation. And we have the works of N.A. Duwana giving us the 3 sets of 14 making 42, which turned out to be the number of temples in ancient Samaria in 42 separate city-states, and each one having its own temple, its own versions of gods and goddesses, its own mythos, mythologies, and she wove all together into a tapestry. And we have her 42 temple hymns, each one for one of those parts of a puzzle, because she was capable of a very poetic, high artistic consciousness, because of a fully developed visionary capacity that she was born with, because her father was Sargon of Akkad, who by the time she was being born, she had 2 older brothers, and Sargon's empire was not one of a military nature, but of extended huge caravans. It was a trading empire, and it spread from the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean to the Indus River Delta Valley, huge basin in India. And so from Cyprus to the Indus, Sargon specialized in having a caravan route that spanned the entire range of a whole scalar of civilization. by 2350 BC. We inherit still many of the qualities that were given then, but it was only for beginnings, because the 2350 and the 4350, being a 2,000-year period, as we've talked about, with the 3,350 BC millennium midpoint, all of these time forms came, as we have discussed all during this year, to a progressive realization that with a high poetic, expressive written language that could be read, written and read, the scale of communication of language became larger than life regularly and usually, so that one would be able to have rituals and myths and symbols that were alive in vision, in art, and in history, that eventually led to an analytic capacity that is science. We live in a very special cusp of this kind of very old, ancient complex of time forms of all kinds. And today we come to the 12th day, pre-day of Christmas, which is like capable of being tuned, if we will, if we decide, if we do, as a tuning fork with the day of Epiphany in 2015. We have the poetic freedom in civilization now to step out of old time forms with comprehension to celebrate the opening of new time forms which are significant. Pursuant to that, what is of interest as we come to a personal focus now is a woman of our own time, for instance, who embodies, who has lived a very special quality of coming to comprehension of all of the various levels of the old and stepping really, realistically, into the dawn of the new. Her name is Carolyn Porco. She was born in 1953 in the Bronx. She's a New Yorker. She, according to her Wikipedia, she was born March 6, 1953, an American planetary scientist known for her work in the exploration of the outer solar system. She began with the Voyager ongoing expeditions as Voyager was reaching beyond Jupiter. And what was it reaching beyond Jupiter? It was Voyager by that time in 1983 was beginning its leaving behind the qualities not only of Jupiter but of Saturn, and reaching out to a planet which had only been discovered about a couple of hundred, not even 200 years before, the planet Uranus. So that as Carolyn Porco came into her profession, she was educated at Caltech, and then she refined her education at New York University at Stony Brook, and in joining at JPL, associated with Caltech since its inception, and still, She came in where one was leaving the last classic locus of the farthest that previous civilizations had taken into consideration, and that is Saturn. That Saturn somehow was the farthest that the naked eye cosmos of what was dynamic under the stars and in relationship to the sun, in its complement the moon. There were 5 planets. They were moving stars whose orbits had eventually become understandable, first as circles, then finally as ellipses, and then finally as an understanding that led to the expectation that there's something beyond them. And that was the planet Uranus. So that Carolyn Porco comes at what was a culmination of Saturn and leaves for Uranus. These are volumes from the University of Arizona Planetary Sciences in Tucson, University of Arizona Press. These are commemorative volumes that are now completely out of date because of what we have learned just in the short generation since then. And Carolyn Porco, most important among those who have led the learning, because she is the head, the chief in charge of the imaging of the Cassini expedition to the Saturn system. She is the one, in fact, who, when she joined JPL, the Voyager team, was instrumental as a young genius at setting up the way in which we were going to prepare to image Uranus. And not only did she do that in 1986, but even farther. Uranus is twice as far from Earth as Saturn. Saturn is 1 billion miles away. Uranus is 2 billion miles away. But even farther out was Neptune. And in 1989, Neptune was visited by Voyager 2. At Jupiter, Voyager 1 was sent off into a perpendicular, and so its orbit carried it as a straight diagonal out of the plane of our star system, out of the planetary plane, and that it would be a way in which one could eventually, if the technology held up, as it has, we would be able to have the experience in a generation, maybe a little bit more, of Voyager 1 being able to leave the magnetic sheath of our star system moving through the interstellar medium. And because of Voyager 2 having to have more power, of speeding up, of being able to go as far into the planetary disk as Uranus and eventually Neptune, and into realms which were also going to challenge the magnetosheath. And both Voyagers, almost like a tuned choreography, would do that just about a year ago, of enter into that magnetopause where the solar wind slows and balances because the pressure of the dynamic of the interstellar medium meets the pressure of the solar wind, which all the time had carried the energy of our star, of the sun, of Sol, and lighted not just our world, but all worlds within the star system. And that energy of light would be able to still carry into the interstellar medium, but the oomph of its particality would reach what we call the magnetopause. This is the first step into the interstellar frontier. But what happened with Carolyn Porco is that as she refined the preparations for Uranus, and then doubly refined, because the instrumentation had to be taxed and recalibrated all the time to be able to not only collect the data for Voyager 2, but to be able to communicate it, because it takes a long time for that telemetry to work, even at the speed of light. One gets into a very long delay when one gets out to the orbit of Neptune. It prepared her to do a recursive quality when the opportunity came up that there was going to be a revisit of the Saturn system in an extended stay, not to just cursorily gaze as one drove by, but to go to the whole system, like Galileo would do around Jupiter and its moons, that around Saturn and its rings and its moons, Cassini would be paired with another exploratory vehicle, the Huygens Mission, that would be built by ESA, the European Space Agency, and Cassini built by NASA, the Americans, and that they would pair together, that Huygens would piggyback with Cassini, and that it would be a quality of being able to stay in the Saturn system, which is much more complex than the Jupiter system or any other planetary system. And so, as one had in the early days, this is a monograph from NASA, The Atmosphere of Titan. It's a falling apart paper-bound from 1974. And their reports were about like so, because no one knew very much at all about Titan, except from guesses and a few facts. And it wasn't until 2002 that Lifting Titan's Veil, Exploring the Giant Moon of Saturn, was published by Cambridge University Press. But even then, it was beginning to be apparent that we were on the verge of something completely unknown, unexpected. And the next year, in 2003, the Cassini-Huygens Mission, published by Kluwer Scientific Publishers in 2003, and they had so much that had come into play that a simple little volume, a couple of hundred pages from Cambridge, the next year, by 2003, it had to be in 2 volumes. This is volume 1. It's only about the Huygens. Volume 2, a little thicker, this is 750 pages, was about Cassini, and all of it was of a preliminary quality because it hadn't reached the Saturn system yet, which it would very quickly, within a year or so. All this time, Carolyn Porco was in charge of not only handling the imaging, what is this complex package of instruments doing? What is it seeing? What is it audioly picking up? What is the telemetry calibrations of all kinds? Because one is dealing with not telescopes, but astrophysics. And so the complexity of the Cassini imaging is like a super carnival. And she was able, because she has an artistic nature. When she was a beginning adolescent, at age 11, one of the great things that happened for her was the, coming up to her 12th birthday, was the introduction of the Beatles. Her music into the United States, and over the next couple of 3 years, she was completely engrossed in the elan, in the charisma of the Beatles. And when one looks at her Wikipedia, you see a photograph of Carolyn Porco at 60. A shot of her walking across the street in Pasadena with her whole imaging team of Cassini, and it is a replay of the Beatles' Abbey Road record cover, because she specializes in dance as well. In fact, she won a prize just a handful of years ago at a Michael Jackson dance costume, and where she won. She took the trophy. So she is artistic in a dynamic way. It reminds those of us who are familiar with science fiction of Catherine Asaro, who is a jazz ballet dancer, among many other things. It's a quality of Carolyn Porco that she is at home in the dancing, a huge complexity that has resonances. It has a harmonic, but it has the free form of surprises, of mysteries that disclose and then go back. They're hidden or come out for an extended while and then modify, then change, recursively come back into play in different costumes and so forth. She's masterful at this. So along with the experience of Voyager imagery, and now 10 years of Cassini imagery, when they began to put together the imaging of Pluto, she was put in charge again. So that you have in Carolyn Porco a Bronx girl, Caltech educated, JPL bred, and when she was put into the Pluto expedition, is called New Horizons. You talk about a shift in time forms. It's due at Pluto July of next year, 2015. She was a tenured professor at Caltech. She moved to Boulder, Colorado, to the Southwest Research Center there, which in tandem with JPL handles the Dawn, New Horizon. Dawn, at the same time as New Horizon going to Pluto, Dawn went to the asteroid belt. In particular, it went to the asteroid belt so that it would have a Cassini-like orbiting, not only of planets in the system, but an orbiting of the two largest asteroids in the asteroid portion of the solar disk. And the first was Vesta, and the second will be Ceres, coming up in 2015, just as the culmination of New Horizons getting to Pluto. Dawn will have its celebration of its apex of orbiting for at least a year, maybe more, the largest asteroid of all, Ceres. This issue that just was put out by Icarus, International Journal of Solar System Studies, is completely devoted to papers on Vesta. So that Don already is going into the scientific history of living achievements that are still underway, expansions that are still adding meaning. And all this time, Carolyn Porco is handling the great dynamic, the extension of the diameter of the understanding of the star system, all the way out, not only to Pluto, but its giant moon, Charon, its 4 little subsidiary moons, Nix and Hydra, Kerberos and Styx, and they're looking to find new qualities. One of the great discoveries of Carolyn Porco was that there is an acoustic resonance that shapes Saturn's rings that matches and tunes to levels and layers in the body of Saturn itself. So that what in Saturn are density waves that come out as an acoustic vibration has a musical, danceable harmony, and the Saturnian rings perform a likewise layering of themselves. And so she is the one who spearheaded the understanding that not only Saturn does this, but other bodies do this, including the sun. So that it is the sound of light gonging the sun like a bell that when it is finally heard becomes the dynamic of the solar wind. So let's take a little break and we'll come right back. Let's come back. This is a postcard from JPL inviting my wife Nisa and I to Huygens Arrives at Titan. Thursday, January 13, 2005. We're at December 13 today, 2014. So just about 10 years ago. The 10 years, the decade of Cassini-Huygens at Saturn, especially with the quality that someone like a Carolyn Porco is able to bring, an artistic quality to the science, so that she tunes art and science. In our Learning Civilization program, the first year of 2 is the nature cycle. Nature, ritual, myth, symbol that has its transform into vision, art, history, science, so that the qualities of the equinoxes are qualities of form in the Learning Civilization paired year program. My wife Nisa's app that brings it into a presentation from a very interesting context of we're going on a journey. We're going on a very high yana. We're going on a Parayana, and our vehicle is a starship, the Hummingbird. And the app is startling in its quality of art and science together that bring in not only the preparatory qualities of field and process into the way in which forms take emergent shape. At the equinoxes, the solstices of an initial sense of a field, and then the other solstice, a sense of the flow of that, in that field. In the first year, the flow is the flow of experience, of myth, of the mythos, the mythic horizon of language, images, feelings, and this flow is within the field of nature. In the second year, what has opened up through the transparency, the portal of the symbols, is a whole second, not a second cycle. It's an ecology of expansion into a harmonic, where the 4 seasons as 4 phases in the first year now have a transform into the phases becoming dimensions. So that vision is not a 5th phase so much as a 5th dimension. That the entire quaternary of space-time as 4 dimensions is gone beyond, not to erase it or efface it, but to expand, deepen, heighten, widen into scalars almost unexpressible except doable before, and now there. And so the field of vision is an infinite field of reality, of differential consciousness that is deeply in complementarity with the zero field of nature that allows for ones to emerge whole, like a Tao Te in the Chinese, that out of the mysterious zero field Tao, the unity, oneness, exactness of the Te occurs in such a way that it is fertile to have more levels of Te, more, rather than just some kind of a point which beautifully in astrophysics at Caltech a few years ago, when it was apparent that the structural elements of that make up the atom, that make up the nucleus of the atom, is made up of points in triplicate, like the proton, made up of 3 quarks. And quark is a phrase that Murray Gell-Mann picked out of literature, out of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, to express the mysteriousness of these super refined points, pointillistic, and that quarks cluster, they never appear as singles, they always appear as pairs, or sometimes, most of the time, when they make a form to hold in a nucleus, like the proton, they'll be in triplicate, 3. The latest developments at Cern, looking at all of the trillions of bits of information gathered through the first preliminary running of Cern, not yet at full strength as it will be next year, after a hiatus of trying to process, Cern physicists discovered 2 new subatomic particles that are, yes, they're made of 3 quarks, like the proton, but each one of the 2 is 6 times as heavy as the proton. They're really massive particles. They're called chi b, with a superscript b, little font, chi b prime, and chi b double prime. What Cern is looking for is to come upon a particle which does not fit the standard model, whereas the standard model could accept that, all right, surprise, surprise, but chi b prime and chi b double prime still fit in. They just expand the pieces of the puzzle. And do we have all of the puzzle? We will not know until we come upon a particle in the nucleus that is participant in the strong force that holds it into its integral, a nucleus, that does not fit into the puzzle of the standard model. It's a piece that was not in that puzzle, so that puzzle was a false limit. The model, standard as it's been, will no longer be acceptable as the be-all and end-all. They're looking for a particle that does not fit. In terms of what we are developing here in the Parayana and beyond in the learning civilization itself, is that there is a massive shift that cannot be measured from the four-dimensional continuum of space-time into a fifth dimension where differential consciousness comes into play. It's like in the theater, the fifth business is the magic of the theater. It's the magic of the performance, the magic of the night. Anyone who's been in one of those kinds of theatrical plays, live, not a film, knows that there are magical evenings. And the first time I experienced that in high school, I played Malvolio in a production of Twelfth Night, and the director was working on his PhD, LLD from Britain, and he was directing it. And one of the performances with pit and balcony players was a magical evening. Not that we were great actors, but that Shakespeare's theater produced with the elan of discovery happening while you were playing it, and the audience resonating with it because they were like Saturn's rings in acoustic resonance with the acoustic seismology of what was happening on the stage, in the play. All the world's a play for that audience of the differentially conscious who are understanding that this is live theater. And someone like a Carolyn Porco is enormously interesting, not as a protagonist in some kind of a plotted scenario, but as a free-form creative artist. Her speciality was not just Saturn's rings and its density wave layering and structuring, of which she expanded it immensely. There were many new rings that were found, and not only rings, but the whole realization, because Cassini was refined enough to see there are shepherding little moons that keep the integral layering of the planet's seismology of acoustic waves into the density waves that are expressed in the structure of the many, many rings now, and the shepherding moons as well. And even within gaps between what were rings before, there are little mysterious qualities of rings. And not only that, her imaging people found Not only does Saturn have rings, but Uranus has rings as well. And there are very faint, but nevertheless there are rings around Neptune as well. So that when one comes out with, this is published, Cambridge Planetary Science, the hardcover is April 14th, 2014, Planetary Rings, a post-equinox view. And so just earlier this year, Cambridge Publishing, and it mentions Carolyn Porco quite frequently. By the way, her great personal book, published in hardcover October 27th, 2014, The Art of Space, the History of Space Art from the Earliest Visions to the Graphics of the Modern Era. And you can find it on Amazon under Carolyn Porco. The Art of Space. It is this quality of the artist, the creative imaginative, who remembers and furnishes for memory, not just the memory in the symbolic structure of the mind, but of remembering while one is in the visionary dimension of differential consciousness, that it comes through a prism, the prismatic crystals, if you will, of the artistic person, that one gets the full spectrum, one gets the astrophysics of the universe become a cosmos. And that spectrum in the learning civilization is history. That history is the complex, conscious, kaleidoscopic flow of differential consciousness in the field of vision as a differential conscious infinite field through the prism of the conscious, artistic, creative imagining, remembering person, that the science then will emerge in complement, in tuned with the art. It is this quality then that allows for a seismology of resonance to tune to the density waves of an expression of it that gives the arts and sciences their university level Renaissance style of exploration into furthering understanding by inquiry, into furthering that analytic by a complementarity with an aesthetic, an appreciation that all of this is personal, which is shared. It isn't just the individual as the be-all simple center of a circle of space-time, but it is in play as a universe expanded to a cosmos that is a dynamic that is available for the adventures of discovery. One of the great early Renaissance, 2,000 years before our Renaissance, about 500 BC. One of the great figures in that Renaissance was Pythagoras. And what is remembered from Pythagoras, his 3 great books have been lost, conveniently lost in later centuries due to the obfuscation of those who enjoy obscuring. What remained were some sayings of Pythagoras, and one of the most mysterious of his sayings, the ancient Greek phrase was ipsa dixit, he said. He said geometry is history. In a dynamic consciousness way of further dimensioning, which Pythagoras was very capable of, and those around him, the Pythagoreans, interestingly enough, the Pythagoreans were one of the first communities to have parity between men and women. Pythagoras' wife later in life is finally married, and Theano was the author of a couple of surviving long fragments of letters, very discursive, quite artistic, quite scientific, which illuminated, because they were found in fragments of papyri that were found in Egypt, that a very large letter existed from a woman some almost unsuspected. Not only did Theano write scientific artistic letters, but later on the influence of Theano influenced a woman one of whose long letters still exists, and one can find it in translations. Her name was Perictione, and she was the mother of Plato. Yes, Plato had a mother, a very literate, conscious, artistic, scientific mother, which is how Plato got Pythagoreanized as a young man growing up. And it wasn't until his own development of the way in which he was expanding himself as being like a super tutor. He was tutoring very powerful men, almost exclusively, and finally came to be tutoring the tyrant of Syracuse on Sicily, Dion, and Dion's son, another Dion, and decided that Plato was corrupting his son, his potential family rule of the power of his kingdom, and so he jailed Plato. And Plato was sprung from his imprisonment by a man named Archytas, who was a Pythagorean, who was the head of a community in South Italy, and brought Plato out of prison from Syracuse into the Pythagorean communities of South Italy, and there it was that they enlightened him. That Pythagoras, in order to become the Pythagoras of kaleidoscopic history, of differential conscious vision, had a very special kind of a childhood himself, developed by a mother who was very much like Perictione, highly intelligent and sensitive, of Plato, the mother of Pythagoras, was the head priestess on Samothrace. And when she met and fell in love, and they decided to get married, her husband ran big shipping concerns from the ancient Phoenician coast of the Eastern Mediterranean with the Aegean and beyond, and they were married at Delphi. And Pythagoras' mother took a new name, Pythias, from the Pythian oracle, because the Pythian oracle, always a young woman, seated on the tripod, the three-legged stool, over the vapors coming from the mysterious depths of the earth to be a different atmosphere, a visionary atmosphere that only she could develop in such a high poetic. They were always riddles, because it was not just a poetic, it was an analytical displacement that was a scramble that would take extra dimensions of consciousness to be able to understand, like the squiggles that make up a Feynman diagram or a molecular structure. And so she named her pregnancy to come Pythagoras. He will be born as Pythagoras, the son of the vision of the Pythian Apollo. And he will be able to make a resonant set of 9 muses in a parenthetical scalar that will be indexed by a 10th, and that this will be indeed a new way to have all of the arts with a comprehensive cosmic science analytic capacity. And this would be someone who would be schooled not only in the upbringing on their home island of Samos in the Aegean. Samothrace is at the very top near Thrace, Samothrace. Thrace, where Orpheus, some 1,000 years, millennium before, had been a great sage and poet. Pythagoras went from this fertile household at age 21 and went to Egypt, where the family had business ties. He was born in 570 BC, and so it was about 550, 549 BC, and he spent 22 years in Egypt. And after that, he spent 11 years in ancient Iran. And only later, in his mid-50s, came back to Samos, matured, and matured again, and matured yet again. So Plato went off to Egypt. He went to Heliopolis, where Pythagoras had been for 22 years. He stayed long enough to understand that what one does with this expansiveness is to share it. Because its mysteries are mysteries of presence, not of the present. It's not of countable time. It's of uncountable vistas. And he went back to Athens and founded the Platonic Academy. And for 40 years taught and headed the Academy of Plato in Athens. And that expanded the Pythagorean communities into what we understand now. We understand it as the beginnings of philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead said all of philosophy seems to be a footnote to Plato. But it's Pythagoras as the seed of the garden of Plato become the whole landscape of the love of wisdom, philosophy. Pythagoras was the first to say, I'm a philosopher. I love Sophia. I love Lady Wisdom. When we look at the learning civilization, its quality in consciousness is to have those wonderful equinoxes of art and science, where there's an art of recognizing. Plato says over and over again in his various dialogues that First of all, learning is not cognition, it's recognition. And we can't recognize until we have the ability to have companionability. We have to be able to have someone that we can talk to in such a way that the conversation is two ways. It's a minimum of two, tuned as a dialogue. Monologues don't cut it. Monologues make for ego. I'm the whole show. No, you're not. You're just a display. This quality of the dialogue can be expanded. It can be expanded to 2, into 3, like quarks. Now you got a proton. Now you have something that is really a universal nucleus with 3. It can be more. The next level at which the stability holds of the exploration of a conscious dimensioning, more than 5, at least 6 by the time you have an artist, 7 by the time history is brought into play, and 8 when there's science. It is a quality where the exploration, like Carolyn Porco, realizes that there is life beyond what we considered to be life, and one of her specialities, beyond rings of Saturn and rings of Uranus, rings of Neptune, is to look at the moons of Saturn, and her specialty was the closest major moon to Saturn, Enceladus. And she's the one that noticed first in the photographic readout of the telemetry that Enceladus has liquid water spewing in volcanoes of it, especially at the South Pole. And that spectrographical analysis of that water shows organic compounds, carbon-based. Enceladus can support life. We're going to come back next week and look more at presentation 51 of some of the tremendous recognitions going on in science. But as art recognizes, science realizes. And so the stability of art recognizing who, it's person to person, to persons. Plurals without limit, without end. Science is realizing why. And just as shared presence, recognizing who, all the whos, and science realizing why, all the whys, there is a deadening that is not shared presence that can best be called incurred absence. An incurred absence cherishes, sabotaging who and why by having a doubting what and a missing where. Where is it? You can't find it, you can't see it, prove it. You don't know what. We doubt it. We doubt it. And with their doubting what, they make a neon why not. More next week.